If you're someone who's tried to stop binge eating through intermittent fasting, giving up processed foods, or calorie counting, this video is for you. You've probably heard people out there saying, I stopped binge eating through doing any one of these things or a combination of these things. And there is evidence that can be pulled on to go, these things are good for you. These are not extreme. This is not dieting. This is just taking responsibility for your health. And all of them involve some kind of parameter which will keep something like you crazy out of control person with food, it will keep you in check. Take intermittent fasting, for example. It's very appealing if you binge, because if you're a binge eater, quite often it feels easier not to start eating than to start eating and have to stop. So if you shorten your eating window to whether it's 8 hours of eating, 6 hours of eating, 4 hours of eating, there's a sense of how much damage can I do in a shorter space of time? Well, if you're anything like me, it turns out quite a lot. As with anything I tried, it felt like it was working for a few days, maybe a week. But then at some point, it started to go wrong. I would find that towards the end of my eating window, that scarcity mindset where like after 6 p.m. I'm not going to be allowed to eat anything just drove more eating. So I found that my body often felt uncomfortably full and overwhelmed with food because it was still binging. And the other thing that I found personally, and this is such a personal thing, we need to listen to our own bodies when we are trying to implement any of the advice that's out there. But I found that with intermittent fasting, my satiety signals just felt dialed down. I found it harder to feel satisfied with food. It was hard for me to get in the amount of food that I needed in a shorter eating window. So I'd find I'd feel full, but not satisfied, still feeling like I needed to eat more, which I then judged myself for. Because if you binge, you know that feeling very well. You feel full, but that impulse, that desire to eat more, that's the conflict, because you think I shouldn't be hungry because I'm full. But part of being regulated with food is being able to experience satisfaction. And so for some people with intermittent fasting, it affects those cues, but not everybody. So when you're hearing about any of these things working for someone else, remember that binge eating is a complex problem, and there are many reasons why somebody might struggle with binge eating. Now let's talk about the hotly contested topic of processed food. There are times in binge cycles where I would be eating nothing but processed food, nothing but takeaways and convenience food, because I was also in such a mental spiral as well that the thought of getting food and preparing food just felt impossible. Now, the evidence-based treatment for binge eating involves having all different types of foods, because one thing we know about the psychology of binge eating is trying to cut out certain foods or trying to diet and control is part of what then triggers the binging. So it might sound sensible to go, well, if I was eating like whole foods and fresh foods, that would benefit my health. I would be less likely to binge on those foods because they're harder to eat more of. Not impossible. I work with a number of people who will binge on quote unquote healthy foods, but we do know that for many people, it tends to be the processed foods that you're drawn towards. So it makes sense, if I'm not eating these processed foods, I'm not going to binge, because I'm not going to binge on broccoli, am I? So then it begs the question, well, is there a more nuanced way of introducing this? Maybe it's just, I eat less processed foods. I don't have to cut it out, but I eat less of it. Now, again, there's something in my psychology, because my brain, my primal brain, has been triggered around food. Now, if your brain, your primal brain, has never been triggered into thinking that food is scarce and you've not known that binge response, then you could probably do something like this and it not have a big impact. I'm going to eat a bit less processed food, a bit more of this over here. But the problem is, with how my brain has been affected with my history of binging, is that if I start saying to myself, I need to eat less of that, there is a part of my brain that is outside of my control that will fixate on the thing. And of course it's frustrating. And I used to see this as some kind of moral failing, but I have just decided to accept it and work with it. And trust me, that I think is the path to freedom. And yet, I recognize that if I were to be eating these kind of processed foods, takeaways all the time, I don't think that would benefit me either. So what do? How do I handle this monkey mind? Here's what I did when I was trying to pull myself out of a binge cycle. I would simply plan to eat more, and I say whole foods, I mean more home-cooked foods. Here's the important piece. I'm not telling myself I cannot have the processed foods or I should eat less of that. But I am planning some nourishing meals that I'm actually looking forward to. One of the meals that I used to have all the time when I was binging was I used to have salmon and a whole load of steamed vegetables, and I put pesto on it and it was delicious, and I was convinced that this was a satisfying meal because I felt full and because I enjoyed it. But what I actually discovered when I was recovering was when I added some potato in that, I was like, oh, this is what satisfied actually feels like. So if you're somebody who feels like you are pulled towards processed food a lot, this is the part that's so boring about recovery for me, is that I have to intentionally plan foods, plan meals, because if I don't, I would be grabbing convenience food on the fly. And that's not bad, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do know what it does to my eating and what it does to my sense of internal regulation around food, and I don't want that for me. So this advice out there, eat less processed food, sounds quite sound, and obviously I appreciate that's very subjective, eat less, but I find that rather than saying to myself, eat less of this, I do say to myself, eat more of this. And I can still have these other foods when I fancy them, but I find that my desire for them lowers when I'm nourishing myself with other foods. And I'm trying to choose my words so carefully here because I don't want this to turn into any kind of rule, because that's not going to help you. And you might be someone who naturally gravitates towards preparing foods and whole foods and all of those kinds of things, but I'm not. So if you're like me, it is intentional, it is boring, and unfortunately it does take some effort. There's kind of no two ways about that. It doesn't just happen for me. Now let's touch on calorie counting. Of course, calorie counting can be taken to extreme by going very low calorie, but I also met many people who are going, I'm just counting calories and I've set myself a reasonable number that I don't think is a weight loss number, because I just can't trust myself to know how much food I need. So I want to give myself enough food, I don't want to restrict myself, but I need a number and I need to keep myself within that limit. I have had the odd comment on my channel where people say they've done that and that this has helped with their binge eating. But for me, anyway, I have tried to do this. I have tried to just go, okay, I'm going to set myself a very generous calorie limit that maybe is slightly higher than what I think maintenance is. We don't know. This is the thing with calories. We don't know. And there's a couple of reasons why this would make my binging worse. One is the whole psychology piece that I mentioned earlier. There's a part of me that is going to rebel against that it's going to feel like a restriction. I'm not allowed something, now my brain is going to focus on it even more. But the second piece that I have realized as I've become much more in tune with my own body is that my appetite fluctuates massively. So if I'm trying to eat the same number of calories every day, I'm going to be getting in a battle with my appetite. There's just no two ways about it. And I always thought as well, because I have like a hormonal condition, hypopituitarism, whereby my pituitary gland doesn't produce the hormones it's supposed to, so I'm on a range of hormone replacements. I thought, well, my signals are broken, so actually I need this calorie limit. I'm going to be sensible about it because I know that trying to restrict is going to trigger binging. But if I keep within this calorie limit, that's how I will manage this insatiable appetite that is just broken. But what I found is that when I look after my psychology around food, when I actually plan, which I still resist, but I know that it is worth it for me. I've had enough of the rewards to know that I do need to plan my meals, that actually I can have a sense of regulation around food. But I can't do it by setting these rules and these parameters. It needs to be gentle. It does need to be intentional, because I think sometimes people go the other way. They think, okay, no rules, no parameters. I'm just going to go completely unconscious and not give a second thought to what I'm eating. Believe me, I tried that too. That's where I kept tripping myself over with the permission piece of intuitive eating, because I thought, oh, permission, great, I can eat what I want and not give it a blind bit of thought. And I spoke with Evelyn Tribole, who is co-authored Intuitive Eating. She came on my podcast, one of the principles of intuitive eating is gentle nutrition. She was saying that for a lot of people, that intention, that principle isn't even necessary. But for me, it absolutely was. I needed that piece as well. And on my last video I did about intuitive eating, I mentioned potentially doing a course, and I got more messages back than I expected. So I think I'm going to do it. So if you are interested in doing an intuitive eating course with me, the angle I'm going to take is around how to adapt intuitive eating to make it work for you. Because there's a rebel in me. I don't want to follow a program. I don't want to follow 10 principles in any kind of, I say structured way, but any way that feels confined. Because I don't think everybody needs all 10 principles anyway. So that's the idea. So if you are interested in finding out about the course when I release tickets, make sure you're signed up to my mailing list, and I'll pop the details below. But I wanted to make this video because if you are somebody who has tried these things and they sound really reasonable, and there's evidence to back them up as well. And I'm not suggesting that we ignore the evidence. We say this stuff is bad. This stuff doesn't, any of the stuff I've said doesn't have to be bad. But the part I'm inviting you to think about is, what is the impact on you when you try to do these things? What's the impact on your eating? And rather than blaming yourself for not being able to stick with them, it's about understanding your psychology and how to work with it instead of getting into a battle with it. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.